Hello, friends. Do you want to elevate your cannabis brand or product? Let's get real. Standing out in the cannabis industry isn't a walk in the park. That's where Green Lane Communication comes in. They're not just a cannabis-focused PR firm. They're your partners in getting genuine, valuable coverage, from features in major publications to shoutouts in niche blogs and podcasts. Hey, like this one, Cannabinoid Connect. But Green Lane Communication isn't just about making headlines. They're about building your narrative, crafting messages that speak directly to your audience, and creating robust media strategies that hit the mark. Whether you're just starting out or you're a seasoned player in the cannabis game, they've got the chops to amplify your presence. As we gear up for conference season and head into Q4, there's no better time to boost your brand's trust and credibility. Ready to make waves in the cannabis world? Reach out to Green Lane Communication. Check out their offerings at greenlanecommunication.com or find the link right in our episode description. Let's elevate your cannabis journey together with Green Lane Communication.
3, 2, 1, liftoff.
Cannabinoid Connect, the nation's most diverse cannabis-related podcast.
Click record. Anthony Coniglio, how are you, sir? Great to have you on.
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's important before we kick this conversation off, you being the president and CEO of NewLake Capital Partners, is just to get a sense and allow the audience to get a sense of your background. You know, the journey into the cannabis real estate business, especially, I mean, you transitioned from a successful career in finance and banking. I mean, you worked at JP Morgan, among other big firms. So tell us a little bit about what inspired this shift and how your previous experience has really been advantageous, to your current role.
Yeah, it sounds great. And again, Kevin, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited for the discussion. My journey, my career has spanned roughly 35 years. I started my career at Price Waterhouse, auditing banks and asset managers, was hired by one of my clients, a bank, finally found my way to JP Morgan, running various businesses on the banking side at JP Morgan before leaving there in 2011 to go start a residential mortgage company. And we grew that business significantly, scaled it up nationally, and then sold it out to a private equity firm. And so when I was looking for the next opportunity for my career back in late 2018, I was looking for an industry that had some of the qualities that were similar to the businesses I ran at JP Morgan and then what we did at the mortgage company. And it was all about finding high growth industries that were looking for some new innovation, that were looking for some professionalization. Maybe they were off the run type of businesses. And we thought we could bring some professionalism to various of those, bring some discipline around the business and scale them up pretty significantly. And when we started looking at the cannabis real estate business, we realized there were very few options for the operators back in 2018, 2019. Quite frankly, even so today, few options to fund the significant capital expenditures that are required around real estate. Because as we all know, and your listeners probably know, you have these state infrastructures that have to be replicated because of the state rules. And so in looking at that, we said, wow, significant need for capital. We can bring some professionalism into the industry with our backgrounds, and we could scale this business up in a high growth way.
Yeah. And which just could be super complex, right? When you're dealing state by state. I mean, because every regulation's different, right, among the state legislation, but then also some states have where municipalities step in, right? So even at the local level, you're dealing with certain regulations. So I guess that's a great segue to kind of talk about, the value add that NewLake Capital Partners presents to the industry, right? So let's talk specifically about what NewLake does, focusing on like what your role is, as an internally managed real estate investment trust, providing these services to the state licensed operators who need them.
Yeah. So what we do at NewLake is we provide capital to the cannabis industry for their real estate needs by acquiring properties from or for the cannabis operators. And so we own 31 properties across 12 states with 13 different tenants. We own cultivation facilities as well as dispensaries. In fact, we own 17 dispensaries and 14 cultivation facilities. But when you look at it on a capital basis, it's roughly 90% of our capital, a little over that, is in cultivation facilities. And it makes sense because those could be $35 million a piece, where a dispensary may only be $2 million a piece.
Right.
We provide capital for improvements. Many times we'll buy a building that needs to be refurbished, or sometimes we do what's called a build to suit transaction, where we acquire the property for the tenant and we construct the building for the tenant. We don't do the construction, but we provide the capital for the construction of the building. But in all cases, we have a signed lease agreement at the outset to lease that property to the tenant for 15 to 20 years.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to talk about that unique approach, the sale leaseback transactions, right? So, talk to me a little bit about that, and maybe also enlighten us on third party purchases, and kind of what overall these projects look like.
Yes. So sale leaseback transaction, first, what I'd say about it is a type of transaction that is utilized widely across various businesses. So think about anybody that has a large footprint of retail or industrial real estate. As an example, Starbucks, Walgreens, FedEx, Home Depot, all these businesses utilize a sale leaseback transaction, which in essence is the concept of us as the sale leaseback provider acquiring the property and leasing it back to the seller. In our case, call it a Cresco or a Trulieve or Curaleaf, leasing it back to them over 15 to 20 years. In many cases, the operator owns the property already. And when you think about the origin of this industry, it was very difficult to secure real estate for cultivation or even retail. So many of the operators utilized their precious capital to have to buy their properties. So it was a tool for them to really raise capital from those real estate locations and raise non-dilutive capital, right? They weren't issuing equity. So they were able to turn those properties into cash. And at the same time, we enter into that long-term contract where they're the tenant, and they'll pay us rent for that period. And so from our investors' perspective, our investors own a diversified portfolio of properties across the country with diversified tenant base. We receive rental income. We have minimal operating expenses. Roughly 1.5% of our assets is a very low operating expense ratio. And we end up dividending out to our investors on a quarterly basis, 80 to 90% of our earnings. So we've been providing dividends to our investors since the inception of the company.
And maybe some of the benefits, right, from the operator standpoint, well, I'm sure there's many. One that's kind of obvious to me, and I think you kind of hinted to this at the beginning of the inception of this, it was like the fact that it was hard for these operators to find space, right, to rent, because a lot of the tenants at the time may have not wanted marijuana or cannabis businesses or to be affiliated with that, right? I mean, was that kind of one factor?
Yes. That was absolutely one factor, and really the primary factor at the outset. What we're starting to see now is really a focus on capital efficiency. And so in this world where operators are focused on generating cash flow and free cash flow and bolstering the balance sheet with cash, or even looking to repay debt, any opportunity to raise capital is going to be a valued opportunity, because then, especially if it's non-dilutive, meaning they don't have to dilute existing shareholders by issuing new shares. And if you think about why do FedEx, Walgreens, why do mainstream companies utilize this, it's because they don't want to utilize their debt capacity to invest in a hard asset like real estate that has very limited economic upside. And so what their investors are giving them capital for is to grow earnings, to grow revenue, and to grow earnings. And so for us, we can step in, and our business is all about real estate, right? Our investors want us to put our capital into real estate and invest in these properties for the long term and generate current income from the rents. And so it's really in alignment with the investor interest. And I think over time, you'll see more and more cannabis companies focus on that capital efficiency in making sure that whether it's the debt they have on the balance sheet or capital they raise from investors is utilized to really drive that top line growth or to drive additional EBITDA for their shareholders.
You mentioned investor interest. So I'm curious, is there a specific set of criteria or key factors that are involved before injecting capital, to a various operator or business?
Yeah, for sure. We have a very rigorous underwriting process, as you would imagine. But we like to focus on limited license states. Let me for a minute explain some of our underwriting process at a high level. Now I'll talk more about the limited license states. So we look at the property. Of course, always in a real estate, you'll try to understand the quality of the property and the location. But we go beyond that. We look at the licensing for the property and the licensing for the jurisdiction. Of course, second, we look at the operator themselves and the credit quality of the tenant that will be in there. And we do everything that you would do in a normal credit underwriting transaction for someone that's going to owe you 15 to 20 years of rent. But what we layer in there is the management team's ability to run a high growth business in a highly regulated industry. It is a unique skill set. And then also importantly, can this management team go out and raise institutional capital? We all know these businesses have a voracious appetite for capital. And so it's important that the business model itself, plus the management team's capabilities, can all support additional capital raising. And then thirdly, I touched on it, it's about the jurisdiction of the property. And so we've really avoided states like Michigan and Colorado and California. We have one dispensary in California that's in a limited license jurisdiction. We like these limited license jurisdictions because we think it's a better operating environment for our tenant, and it provides better value for the properties over time. And so that's why we emphasize limited license states such as in Illinois or in Ohio that recently approved recreational cannabis last week at the ballot box, or a Florida, which hopefully gets through the Florida Supreme Court and sees adult use on the ballot for next year, along with a lot of other limited license states.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought Ohio up. Shout out to Ohio, number 24, right, in terms of adult
Yes.
use states in the country. So we're almost at the tipping point, which is the halfway mark, right? And you
Yep.
mentioned with Florida and then the big gorilla in the room, Texas. I mean, I'd like to just kind of explore, with you from NewLake's perspective, what are some kind of high priority limited license states that you really are focused on? And I guess an added question to that is, what are some exciting projects and developments that y'all are working on as well?
Yeah, I think Ohio certainly is an exciting state. We expect that program to get rolled out end of 24, early 25. It does look like the legislature and the governor want to meddle with the program a little bit, but some of the early commentary suggests that it won't be too significant. So hopefully they can really get that program rolling quickly. We think it's going to be a great state. Actually excited with Virginia, perhaps given the change in the state house in Virginia, maybe finally we can get the voters' will from the previous ballot initiative to finally get adult use cannabis off the ground in Virginia. I think that could be an exciting state. We really like what's going on in Maryland and Missouri, two states that recently approved adult use. And we think those markets are really poised for continued growth. I think you have to be excited about a state like Florida if adult use gets on the ballot and it passes. Significant population. And then if New York ever gets it right, I'm not excited about New York today because I still think it has a long way to go to really get it right.
Right.
But at some point in the future, it really will tee up to be a massive market. And then you touched on Texas. And so the way I think about the map is when you think about the states that were medical that converted to an adult use market, you've gone through most of the blue states. And we're now at the point where with Ohio and Missouri, we're starting to touch those red states. Those red states are just starting to go. They will be more difficult to convert than the blue states were. But when I think about states like Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, there's still that whole kind of southern red belt, if you will, to not only expand their medical program, but ultimately for adult use. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but that is actually future growth. And so when I think as someone that invests in the industry, I think about, do you want to turn everybody on right away? Or do you want to actually have some of this scaled growth so the industry can adapt and so that the consumer habits can adapt? And I think we're going to have that. I think we're going to have state turn-ons consistently really over the next 5 to 6 years as we see some of these red states convert or further develop their medical programs, maybe pass a new medical program, or actually evolve from medical to adult use.
Yeah, I like the way you illustrated that whole kind of flow of what we're seeing. It's just, lack of a better word or phrase, like the domino effect, right? Where you've kind of seen the blue states transition, and now we're seeing the red states start to come online. But I'm curious. I mean, from your perspective, CEO, president of the company, I mean, like what would you think would really help move the needle for some of these red states? Like what story needs to be told, right? Because I mean, we got to know our audience in this battle.
Yes, I've been saying for quite a while, and I continue to have conviction around the belief that this is all about politics. And I believe that state politicians are starting to see that they are not going to suffer from their support for cannabis. And as that takes hold throughout these red states, I think it'll just embolden people. I don't want to say embolden people. I think it'll make people feel more comfortable taking the so-called political risk by not having to feel like they can stand in the way. I mean, just look at the Gallup poll that came out late last week, I believe it was.
Saw it. Yeah.
70%
70.
of Americans support adult use cannabis. Let's just say that again. 70%. There's just about nothing we agree on in this country to the tune of 70%, but it is right? Adult use cannabis. And the politicians can only ignore that. And what's further interesting, when you look at the voting detail in Ohio, when you look at the age stratification and how they voted for the measures, and you look at the age stratification specifically for Measure 2, which was the cannabis measure, the older you got, the less support it has. So as our population ages, you're going to have a growing and growing majority, and you're seeing it through this Gallup poll, a growing and growing majority of people that support. And those will be the people that will be electing that next generation of state legislators. So I think it's about political cover. I think it's about feeling comfortable that you don't have to get in the way of cannabis regulation, and you don't have to be you don't necessarily have to be somebody that carries the flag and screams from the top of the mountain. We just need politicians to get out of the way so some of these good policies can get put into place.
So I couldn't agree more. So are you saying though that right now, like with those red states, with those conservative, those Republican politicians, that they're taking the hard stance to stay in the way of reform because it's politically advantageous for their side? Or are you saying that the pressure of the voter, it's going to be a deciding factor in upcoming elections because cannabis is such a, it's like you said, such a bipartisan issue?
I actually don't think it's the voter pressuring the politicians to not legalize cannabis even for medical use, because maybe I think that's a small minority of voters that come out. But
no, let me clarify. What I mean by that is, my question is like, we have bad choices, right? I'm talking at the presidential level, right? So like and the reason I'm asking this question is because I saw Forbes publish an article about and the title was like, Biden needs to, take a positive stance on marijuana or take action because it could hurt him, right? Because he's already kind of trailing in the polls as we're seeing. And Trump hasn't outwardly, spoke about cannabis, but RFK Jr. has, right? And there's a lot of people that are kind of leaning that way. So my question is, do you think that now and maybe in the future, the fact that a politician is just opposed to cannabis reform is like they're just completely dinosaur, they're not even relevant, they're not even in the conversation? Because that's kind of how I'm reading it at this point.
I think to some extent, although someone that's going to change their vote, I think very few people are going to change their vote based on cannabis policy. Very, very few people. And so I'm not sure that a politician feels that they are risking votes by not getting on the cannabis wagon. I think that back to my politics is central around this. I think to come to the Biden point, I think Biden saw that by getting behind cannabis, there was a lot of positive dialogue and a positive sentiment amongst that younger age group. And he really needed to turn out the vote. And not that they were coming to the ballot box in last year's election and the midterms to vote on cannabis, but it gave them some reason to feel good about that particular party. And it certainly wasn't going to hurt their prospects. And so when you get to Schedule 3, DEA, HHS, that whole recommendation from the HHS to the DEA, again, that's where politics comes into play. And thinking about the timing of when that can go get through the DEA, get through rulemaking. And if they do come out with a Schedule 3, like say we agree with the HHS, how does it get through the rulemaking process and actually get the maximum political benefit for the party? I really do believe the two are tied. I can't guess on what the timing is to get maximum political benefit, but I'm sure there are smart people in the West Wing trying to figure that out.
Right. No, that's well said. No, and that answers my question. Yeah. So getting back to NewLake, I want to ask you one more thing before we move on to, current market conditions. But that is outside of the states that you mentioned that you're really excited about and that you're currently operating in. Have there been any new acquisitions, partnerships, innovative strategies that you're implementing within the real estate market?
We've done few transactions over the last year. This year, we've done 2 add-on transactions with existing build-to-suit deals, one in Missouri and one in Arizona, 2 states with 2 tenants that we just love. But it's been hard to do new deals for a couple of reasons. Number one, the industry is rightly focusing on operational efficiencies and generating as much free cash flow as they can, and at the same time minimizing the capex and the use of cash off the balance sheet, which we applaud and we think is the right thing to do. So in a world where people are focusing on their existing footprint, not looking to build very much, both figuratively and literally, there really is less opportunity to provide capital for real estate. At the same time, we've been going through what is arguably the most difficult period that the cannabis industry has seen. And so we too are stepping back and keeping an eye on the developments on a state-by-state basis, on an operator-by-operator basis, because our contracts, again, are for 15 to 20 years. It's really important to make sure we execute a transaction with a partner that's strong enough that we have confidence we'll be able to make the rent payments for 15 to 20 years. And so in a world of such uncertainty, significantly decreasing prices, or I should say rapidly decreasing prices, it was important for us to take a step back and make sure we really understood where everything was going to settle out and who was going to be able to come out of the other side of this. Because we do think once we get through this period of retrenchment, those that make it to the other side, those are the strong, and those are likely to be the long-term winners in this business because they will have the discipline and the survival to see it through to the long term. Looking forward, we have $90 million of available capacity to go out and do transactions. We're unlevered today. And so, we're looking for transactions, and we just need to find the right mix of credit quality, property level dynamics, and state specific or jurisdiction, limited license jurisdiction dynamics. And so when those 3 align, you'll see us execute a deal.
Yeah. I mean, and you touched on this current retrenchment period, right? And so
Yeah.
I want to dive into that a bit more. And it's a great segue because I want to touch on the current landscape of the cannabis industry and how the real estate market, is battling through that, especially with NewLake's business model.
Yeah. I really applaud what many of the operators have been doing over the last 12 to 18 months. They've been making really hard decisions in many cases, whether that be laying off people or separating with certain business lines, or rationalizing their footprint by selling off a state here or selling off a state there, shuttering facilities, which is a drag on margin. But all of that in an effort to maximize profitability and maximize free cash flow. I think it was critically necessary, particularly for those that have meaningful amounts of debt on their balance sheet. In this industry, when it expanded rapidly in 20 and 21, this industry put a lot of debt onto their balance sheets. And so many of them, in addition to making those hard decisions around people and platform, have also been working hard to extend the maturities and give the business additional runway to grow into being able to pay back those debt loads or put them in a better position to refinance them at lower rates into the future once they have a more fulsome operating cash flow profile. So there's been a lot of hard work. What's really interesting, you started a while back talking about the state-by-state analysis that's necessary. There are many companies that are smaller, not public, off the radar screen, that are doing unbelievably well because they're executing, and they're executing at the local level. We have tenants in our portfolio that are private, that are smaller MSOs, that we look at their financials, and quite frankly, they're doing really, really well. And I think some of the larger MSOs would love to have that type of free cash flow generation and financial performance. And again, part of it is execution. Part of it depends where you're located. Some people just really, really, really understand the market they're in. And I think it's important to note this because it's a great reminder that this industry is similar to every other industry, which is it's all about execution. How are you coming up with your business plan? How are you executing your business plan? How are you doing your inevitable pivot? Because business plans are just plans. They never truly go exactly as you plan, but you have to pivot. And how's your decision-making process work? So I'm excited for what happens with this next phase of growth in the industry, because I think what we've experienced the last 18 to 24 months has really created a level of discipline in the marketplace that's going to be well served for the future expansion.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. That last point, I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, I've said this before many times, the operators in this industry are resilient, right? And especially, like you said, over the past 18 to 24 months, I mean, you're a savage to get through what has been endured, along with, other industries as well, of course. I want to talk about NewLake's impact, though, and from your perspective, with its unique business model, what have you seen, and kind of if you can provide some examples or some success stories that you'd like to share?
So I'd say, I'm sorry, I'm organizing my thoughts. So I'll talk about this and look back and kind of look to today. I think we've been. I think we're very proud of having been able to raise capital in the way we raised it, deploy it on the timeline that we deployed it, and have the portfolio perform the way it has performed. I do believe that given our focus on limited license states, I do believe that part of our underwriting focus, where we focus on property level financials, ensuring there's meaningful cash flow for the properties that we invest in, so that we can pay rent, I think that has served us really well. Particularly related to peers. Of course, our portfolio is not perfect. We've had an issue that we recently resolved. And I think that's another proud moment, right? We were able to demonstrate that nobody's going to be perfect, particularly when you're buying properties in the cannabis industry. But I think we've proven that we've got the capability to work through issues when they do present themselves. And then most recently, it's a really small deal that we did. We just announced that we sold a property for $2 million. The reason I think this is a proud moment for us is we had a tenant that acquired the property, wanted to build out, wanted to get in Massachusetts in a big way. And we looked at the operating environment and we sat down with them and said, this is probably 18 months ago. It's really not a good time to get into Massachusetts. Perhaps you should focus on other states in your portfolio, not take the risk and the execution risk on launching into Massachusetts. And we'll work with you to monetize this property and redeploy that capital into other properties that you have. And we finally closed on that about a week or two ago. And it was great for the tenant because they avoided having to put capital after capital after capital into the difficult Massachusetts market. And it was great for us because we were able to pivot our capital into a quality property that they have in their home state of Arizona. And and we were able to get out at our basis. Now, they would have made up any difference. We wouldn't have taken a loss on it. But I think by being able to sell a property out of our portfolio at our basis in this type of real estate environment just demonstrates what some people say, oh, you overpay for properties. I think that was a great outcome for everybody around. Small deal, took a while to get done. But I think it's a great example of how we partner with people and how we approach our relationship with the tenant. We're not just there to just do a deal. We want to see them succeed because their success is part of our success.
Right, right. And what's NewLake's long-term vision and goals?
Yeah. So long term, so we're publicly traded. NLCP is our ticker symbol. Our long-term goal is to continue to invest into the cannabis sector, continue to pay out dividends to our shareholders, and realize outsized returns on the properties we do invest in as legalization approaches, and then ultimately as federal legalization arrives. We think that the cash flows that we're assembling in our portfolio will be extremely valuable once that legalization occurs, and we'll be able to take on additional leverage and be able to provide even a better total return to our investors. And so real estate, the best analogy we have, what we're trying to do here is cell towers back in the 90s. In the early to late 90s, cell towers were really a misunderstood asset class. And so therefore, in the real estate industry. And so therefore, there weren't a lot of people that provided capital to it. And you were able to get the higher cap rates like we're able to get today in cannabis land. Because as we've said a few times, there's just not a lot of people that have the knowledge or expertise to focus on the sector. But then as that industry normalized and people really started to understand the dynamics, the value of that portfolio appreciated significantly. And we expect to see the same thing, or hope to see the same thing happen with cannabis real estate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, as we wrap up, you touched on kind of a few predictions. I'll kind of say that, that you kind of teased out, but I'm going to ask you point blank, you pull out your crystal ball predictions for next year, regarding the cannabis industry, the real estate market. What do you think will happen?
Yeah. So as best as my crystal ball can tell me, I don't think SAFER happens. I think it's too tall of a task to get through the House, unless I think the only chance SAFER happens is if Section 10, which is that section focused on preventing Operation Choke Point, if Section 10 is enhanced and you can get enough Republicans to believe this is a Section 10 bill, I don't think they're going to care as much about the cannabis part of it. But I think it's to get through the House, I think you're going to need those types of enforcement rules for the regulators. Listen, on Schedule 3, I have no idea, but there's some smart people that I read that should know about this stuff. And it does seem reasonable to me that in sometime 24, we should see a final rule. Again, I'll come back to the politics of it. It's politically expedient for the president and his party to make that happen. And since it's all within the administrative apparatus, I would expect
an election year.
Yeah, exactly. M&A, a lot of people like to make M&A predictions. I just don't see it happening. We made the call a year ago saying 23 would be very little M&A. And I think it was right. And the reason is because anybody that was surviving, and this is going to carry into next year, anybody that's surviving through this period doesn't really want to take on other people's problems and doesn't want to take on their debt load. And so I think you'll see, to the extent you see M&A, I think you're going to see some of the stronger players do some tuck-in acquisitions, maybe a state or maybe some dispensaries. But I don't think you're going to see any sort of blockbuster. It's not going to be a blockbuster M&A year in our opinion. And I think you're going to continue to see the cannabis companies making progress on generating operating cash flow, right-sizing that balance sheet. And if you get a Schedule 3, I think we have the opportunity as an industry to get into a positive feedback loop where we bring in some marginal investors to the industry because now they'll view it as investable. That buoys stock prices. Hopefully the cannabis operators will issue equity off of that confidence to try to begin to re-equitize those balance sheets and bring down those debt levels. Improving those balance sheets should only make the industry more investable. So hopefully then we bring in some more marginal investors and we keep that positive feedback loop going so we could find ourselves at the end of 24 with much better balance sheets, much better cash flow profiles. And I think we all wish we've got much better equity prices.
Definitely some of the catalysts we need for sure. Anthony, really appreciate your time. You have a ton of great insights, and it was great to just kind of hear an overview of NewLake and all the great things that y'all are doing within the real estate market within cannabis. So appreciate your time. Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with before we wrap up?
Now, Kevin, thank you so much for having me. Really, really appreciate you and enjoyed the conversation. If anybody wants more information, they could go to our website at newlake.com, NEWLAKE.com, and our ticker symbol is NLCP.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it again, Anthony. I look forward to having you on again real soon. All right.
Thanks, Kevin. Have a great night.
You too. And thank you all for listening. Bye.
Cannabinoid Connect, the nation's most diverse cannabis-related podcast.